Today I stand before the United Nations General Assembly to share the extraordinary progress we've made. In less than 2 years, my administration has accomplished more than almost any administration in the history of our country. America's so true. Didn't expect that reaction, but that's okay.
Didn't expect to be laughed at. Of course, that wasn't from today. It's my understanding at the moment that Donald Trump is bellowing somewhere on the 18-acre complex about the census. But it was tough to find another moment that so succinctly illustrates what Donald Trump has done to America's reputation on the world stage. Laughter at the UN General Assembly last year. It's a sentiment that has permeated the Trump presidency from its early days right up through this week. As an example, after the British ambassador resigned yesterday following a leak of his private cables with London in which he called the administration inept and uniquely dysfunctional, among other things, the New York Times did some asking around. They wondered how many foreign representatives feel the same way. From that piece, quote, ask members of the Washington Diplomatic Corps about the cables, and their response is uniform. We wrote the same stuff. It could have been any of us, one ambassador who's still serving and therefore spoke anonymously said on Wednesday. So today, using that UN clip as a scene setter, Joe Biden laid out his foreign policy goals and how they reverse some parts of what he calls the Trump doctrine.
American foreign policy, I think, has to be purposeful and inspiring, based on clear goals driven by sound strategies, not by Twitter tantrums. As President of the United States, I would remind the world that we are the United States of America and we do not coddle dictators. The United States of America gives hate no safe harbor. There will be no more Charlottesvilles, no more Helsinkis.
Joining our conversation, Elise Jordan, a former aide in the George W. Bush White House and State Department. Jeremy and Ron are back. Ron, we should mention, is an advisor to the Biden campaign. Ron, I'll let you start. What was former Vice President Biden's objective today, and did he achieve it?
I think so, Nicole. Look, the objective was to put foreign policy front and center in the campaign. I mean, you and I both have been in politics and in the White House. We know foreign policy is never a big political issue, but it often is the most important thing a president handles. And I think having a reckoning on the Trump foreign policy, on the fundamental issue that when the world is divided between free nations and unfree nations, it seems like Donald Trump is batting for the other team way too often. And I think Vice President Biden today laid out his vision. I think laid out his values about what the country should stand for, what we should believe, both here at home and overseas. And I think, he did that very effectively. Let
me put up what he laid out from a policy perspective. Return of the press briefing, which I know some reporters were celebrating. Strict conflict of interest rules for his administration against self-dealing. Kind of amazing. We need to put that on a list. End family separation and the Muslim ban. Reaffirm the ban on torture. Global Democracy Summit on fighting corruption and authoritarianism. End forever wars in the Middle East, including Saudi versus Yemen. Return to the Iran deal if Iran agrees to compliance. Jumpstart talks with North Korea. Ron, a lot of this is double-edged, it would seem, for former Vice President Biden. It's returning to a lot of what people liked most about the Obama years, and it's also undoing what a lot of people, Democrats and Republicans, frankly, feel is the damage being done by Donald Trump. How does he grab all that, run on that, but also project what Democrats say they want, which is the vision for the future?
Well, look, I think that fundamentally the future involves America standing up for what it's always stood up for. And I don't think those values are changing. And I don't think even Democrats, even progressive Democrats, want those values to change. They want to see new policies and new initiatives. I think most of that's on the domestic front. That's why the vice president's talking about health care and climate change and the other issues where we need to make progress. But if we don't stand up for democracy, for the core values this country has always believed in, and frankly for values that have been transcendent in either Democratic or Republican administrations, then we don't have the kind of country that can make the progress we need to make on healthcare, on climate change, on education, on all these other issues.
Elise.
It was a smart tack the way that Biden approached the speech, looking at current domestic issues and tying them into a broader foreign policy agenda. It also helped him evade delayed talk about his previous foreign policy record, namely Iraq and his role as the point person during the Obama years and then the eventual drawdown in Iraq, which some say led to the rise of ISIS in Iraq. So you have him shying away from the particulars about his record and then going and looking at all the problems introduced by the Trump era, and voters hopefully looking to him as a beacon of stability.
Jeremy, I thought that what the vice president was smart to do was to include something that you and I kind of talk around a lot of days. When will a foreign leader say, hey, I'm not going on a trip to Washington, D.C. until they stop caging babies? I'm not going to the United States until they abandon all their legal appeals of the Muslim ban. I mean, he really did take on, I thought, this idea that America stops being America if Donald Trump gets his way out of some of his most extreme domestic policy proposals.
That's right. And the way Vice President Biden articulated it really is a foreign policy that is values-based. I mean, Donald Trump has taken realism, realpolitik, almost to an extreme, to a mercantilist extreme. Everything's for sale. If you flatter Trump, or if you do a deal with him, or put his brand name on a hotel in your capital, as it was planned to be done in Moscow, then you can have leverage over American foreign policy. And I think Joe Biden epitomizes experience, competence, sanity as commander-in-chief. And I actually think nobody who's run for president is more qualified to be commander-in-chief than Vice President Biden.
I think today, Rick Stengel is an example of Biden playing to his strengths. I don't know that there's anyone out there, no Democrat is not comforted by the idea that whether it's Joe Biden or another Democrat, they will return us to these things that sound so normal, but in the time of Donald Trump aren't anymore.
Yes. Well, one of the things he was trying to do, and this will be familiar to almost all of us here, is to use this idea that Secretary Kerry used to say, there's nothing foreign about foreign policy. Foreign policy is one of Biden's strengths, but the idea is to persuade Americans that why should I be interested in this?
Right.
Well, why should you be interested in it? This whole immigration crisis, that's a foreign policy issue. That has to do with our relationship with Mexico and Central America. Why are you paying more at the pump or wherever? That's foreign policy. Why are you paying more for all these goods that you're buying from China? That's foreign policy. Tariffs are foreign policy. Biden wants to explain to the voters, to say, you know what, it's not just some strange foreign international thing. This affects my life every day, and I want a guy in that office who understands that. That is the subtext of his message, and by the way, it's one that I agree with.
What do you think?
Well, I think it's interesting foreign policy within the Democratic primary, right? Elizabeth Warren did a big foreign policy speech where she tied it to corruption, right? She talked about, in a similar way, actually, this idea of sort of free and unfree, right? There are regimes that are corrupt and there are regimes that are uncorrupt, and we want to make sure we're not in the corrupt camp. Senator Sanders did a big foreign policy speech. So I think it's no longer the case. And then, of course, we have a number of American veterans who are running in the Democratic primary. I think it's no longer the case that Democrats feel like they need to cede any ground whatsoever to the Republican Party on foreign policy. I will say I want to see more from Joe Biden in terms of what his vision is that's different than not just repudiating Donald Trump, which, you know, that was Hillary Clinton's strategy. The list of things that Donald Trump does that are embarrassing is very long, but it doesn't necessarily win, you know, every state that he needs to win.
So you want to see more?
Yeah, I want to see more of his own vision that might be different from Barack Obama and different from Donald Trump.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.